Welcome to Messy Liberation, the podcast that dives deep into feminism, business, and personal growth. I'm Becky Mollenkamp.
And I'm Taina Brown. Get ready for another messy conversation through the eyes of two intersectional feminist coaches.
Let's get messy.
Welcome, Dr. Kaela Singleton. Thanks for being on the show today. I know this is the first time you and Becky are meeting, so I will just briefly say that I know you because we went to the same school. We went to Agnes in Georgia. It's a private liberal arts, traditionally women's college, but inclusive of non-binary and gender expansive people. And so we've kind of been vaguely, broadly connected for a while. And then when I started to do some research into the neuroscience of manifestation, I reached out to you to talk about that because you studied neuroscience. So on that note, I will let you introduce yourself and what you do and anything else you want to share with us.
Yeah. Awesome. It's nice to meet you, Becky. It's always good to see you, Tiana. I am a neuroscientist by training. So I did my undergrad at Agnes, where I got a bachelor's in science, in neuro. And then I went to grad school at Georgetown, where I got my PhD in neuroscience. After that, I came back to Atlanta and I was a fellow for a little bit. And my background in neuroscience is actually in pediatric neurodegeneration and neurodevelopmental disorders. But the reason I got interested in neuroscience from a young age was because I was just interested in what motivates people to do things? Why are people the way that they are? And how can we study that? Even though my work really focuses on molecules and cells, I'm still really interested on what galvanizes people to make certain decisions and how we can use science to inform policy and society, but not in a gross, evil genius way. And we know how to motivate people to be in community. What does that look like? And so currently I am the director of grants management at the Cure Alzheimer's Fund. And so I fund a lot of really cool science. And that's really neat. Yeah. I consider myself a radical thinker and a person who is trying, I would say being a scientist isn't a part of my core identity anymore. I just like bringing that to the table in terms of conversations and learning new things.
Yeah. And you put in your intake form that you staged at a butcher shop?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So a stage is chefs do it, when they're getting new experiences at different restaurants. It's kind of like an internship. And for a while when I was in DC, I was there for 6 years. And so we would go to Union Market Food Hall and there was a butcher shop there and a fishmonger. And I would always go and joke with them that I was going to come learn how to do butchery. And the guys there always laughed at me and they were like, no, you should come by tomorrow, 5 a.m. we'll be here. And so one day I was really just down in the dumps about my thesis research. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to go. And so I just went and they taught me how to do it.
Wow.
Yeah.
You just mentioned oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's obvious. I don't think anyone would conceive it as easy, but it's so much harder than it looks because it's so heavy.
It's like a physical job. My husband has been very interested for a long time in doing butchery. He's an educator, but he's never actually done it. And I don't know what it is. He finds it strangely appealing, I guess, the physical and also it being a kind of job where you're just focused. I think it's kind of meditative in a way, right? Because you're just focused on the task at hand and nothing beyond that, really.
Yeah. And you're using your hands. I feel since I have stopped doing bench science, I'm really interested in using my hands and making things.
I know I saw that you do a bunch of art classes. I stalked you on your website before we talked. So I have an unfair advantage. You don't know me, but I know a little about you now. And I saw you do art. So I'd love to talk about that in a little bit, but I'm curious because you mentioned your thesis. What did you do? Because I think sometimes that can open a little window into what you find interesting in your field. So what did you do your thesis on?
So my thesis/dissertation work was on how molecules change across species, specifically in the process of neural development. So I looked at a specific family of transcription factors and how from frog to mouse to human, they have a conservation of function, but how they do that function is very different, the proteins that they use to get it done. And so it involved learning biology and a lot of different model organisms and then sort of converging together to be what's the same and what's different, kind of going back again to that what motivates certain things to happen, like what motivates people to do certain things or certain actions. So I'm really interested in like how that works in isolation, but also all together, like what we can learn from one another. And really what I discovered in that work is that like it's really context dependent. It's both internal factors, like things that are programmed beyond your control, and external factors that motivate development. And like both of those things are equally as important.
Interesting. One thing I wanted to ask is when we talked, like you and I had like a separate conversation because I was just like, can I just like pick your brain? Like every single pun intended, right? When you're talking to a neuroscientist. But one thing you mentioned was that like this concept of dopamine hacking and how like you really can't dopamine hack your way out of certain things. So can you say a little bit about, well, not a little bit, but can you like get into that and talk to us about like what, like from a neuroscience perspective, what is actually happening during a dopamine hack and why that's not like a sustainable resolution for like getting certain things done or whatnot? Just
Yeah,
want to
can you
hear your
also tell us
perspective on that.
what is dopamine hacking for those of us who aren't like as
I think dopamine hacking, I don't know if Dr. Andy Huberman is who, he didn't like invent it, but he might have made it the most famous. He's
boy.
another podcaster.
Oh, I know who he is. I have lots of thoughts about him. I don't know.
Yeah, me too. But so dopamine hacking it's kind of like, I think it's in simplest terms, it's like something that gives your body a rush of dopamine. It's something that's like exciting, adrenaline fulfilling, something that's interesting. Like,
is this why? Is this the cold water plunging? Is that why?
Yeah.
Because I know he's a big advocate of that and all of the bros. Is that an idea?
Exactly.
Like, that's an example of dopamine hacking then? Got
exactly.
it.
There's also like people talk about like dopamine decor, which is just really like decor that makes you happy. That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with dopamine. I would say most of these things don't necessarily have anything to do with like dopamine. They're just like things that bring you enjoyment and excitement and happiness and contentment. And so I think we talked a little bit about the sort of like goopification of self-care, this idea that like through dopamine hacking, through self-care, you can just sort of like rewire your brain to be a very happy place, like a place that doesn't perceive threat. But that's like not really how the brain works. Its whole purpose is to like protect you from things. And so while you can like through meditation and through like observation change the way that you perceive the world around you, you can't like hack yourself into happiness, if only because most of the things that I think that contribute to people feeling unwell and unfulfilled in life are like systemic barriers, and you can't dopamine hack your way out of poverty. Like you can be a more positive person, you can move with more intention, like be less stressed and more grounded in what you're doing, and that takes a level of like calm and like thinking, but you don't have to like cold plunge your way to success. I don't really think that that's like how.
Well, that's great because I think cold plunging sounds absolutely horrible. And I've
absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know
absolutely horrible. Yeah.
I'm curious though, you mentioned happiness. You can't hack your way to happiness, which is, there we go. Here's a quote for the show, but I'm curious about happiness. And I don't know if you have thoughts on this or not. So I'm just asking because I think this idea of happiness as a goal is really interesting. And I'm curious from like a brain standpoint, is happiness a sustainable state? I don't know that it is. And I think that like maybe it's better to aim for contentedness or something, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So I love this idea because it gets to like also a core issue with like the dopamine hacking of it all and like the like self-care of it all, which is that like your brain's goal always is to be in homeostasis. It just wants to be regulated. It wants to like exist in a very chill way. So my dad, in the way that I think a lot of Black fathers are, is really a fan of stoicism, like on accident. He like doesn't believe in really high highs or really low lows. He's like, if you just stay even keeled, like everything's fine.
Is he an earth sign?
Yeah, he is. He's a Capricorn man.
That makes sense. I can relate.
And so he does have a point though, like a big part of how your brain works is just trying to get to equilibrium. It wants to perceive a threat, make a decision, and then like go back to its baseline state. And so I agree wholeheartedly, like, and I think it's taken a lot of unlearning to value contentment more than I value happiness, and to also try and figure out what like makes you content. Cause I don't think it's a thing that people teach you to strive for really in any regard, but it's I think on like a cellular level, even like we're talking about like the balance of ions in order for cells to just like function normally. And so like the metaphor could extend to that too. So I agree with you.
Thank you. That makes me stop because I talk about it a lot with people because I feel like we've been so conditioned in the culture that we live in that happiness is this thing we're supposed to be. It's supposed to be the goal. And I think it's because it really helps fuel capitalism, right? Because
Absolutely.
the things that bring us happiness, which is a temporary state, it's kind of a high. It's that dopamine, I guess, kick or whatever it is, where you're chasing that constantly. So you're having to get something new, something, try something different, go on a trip, buy a thing to help you sort of get that high again. And then inevitably, like you said, your brain comes back to a place of this more even, like calm. And a lot of us get uncomfortable in that space because we think that that isn't enough. We're supposed to be wanting this like excited, thrilled state. And I see it in relationships too, where it's like a relationship is supposed to always feel like that exciting, lustful beginning. And it's like, well, no, that's not sustainable either, right? That's not how we work. So I appreciate you sharing that. I'm curious for you. And I'm sorry, Taina, I don't mean to take over.
No, go for it. I'm enjoying just listening. I get to just absorb all this information.
I'm just curious for you, because you said it's taken you a while to kind of unlearn some of that and to figure out what it looks like for you to find that contentedness. What have you discovered for yourself? Because I think for people who are still in that place of like chasing the happiness thing, they may not even know what contentedness feels like, what gets them there. I'm curious if you could share your journey because it might help others.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like for me, contentedness also goes hand in hand, like getting to contentedness goes hand in hand with ambition. I always tell people that I'm like a recovering girl boss, where instead of being really ambitious about like work and academics and success, now I'm really ambitious about things like rest, about art, about like laying in the sun and reading books. And a part of that was learning like both defining happiness and success for myself, but also taking steps around to be like, if I'm working to build the life of my dreams, which I really have done, why does it feel hollow? Like, why doesn't it feel like this elated peak that we were talking about, like all of the time? In learning that, like, actually the thing that I was really building towards, even as like a little kid, was just a place of safety and security. And once you get that, I think if you're so used to like fast-paced environments or like the highs of new love or whatever, it seems really boring. And I think that's also a part of like adulthood where you're like, no, I need things to be a little bit boring. But I think for me, a lot of it was like self-reflection. A lot of it was also like, I went through like a series of like friendship breakups in my like late 20s, early 30s that were really transformative to me as a person, because I was like, am I asking for people to show up and be in community with me in a way that's like not practical, like not possible? Or am I just like asking the wrong people? And I think it's like a mix of both. I firmly believe that like you can be the author, the villain, and the main character of your story all at once, but you have to take accountability of that. And I think for me, a big part of taking that accountability was like, happiness is not like being happy all the time is not a super sustainable emotion. On the other end of that, like I'm a person that suffers from depression. So I'm like, being depressed also is not a sustainable emotion. So I was like, I have to find this sort of middle ground. And I think through hobbies like cooking, through things like art, through just like listening to podcasts and like learning perspectives, I was able to sort of bridge that gap. Does that answer your question?
For sure. And I know you didn't, Tiny, and you have a question, but I have one more and I'm so sorry.
I was just going to say real quick, like, I love that you brought up the whole boring thing because like,
that's what I
feel like I'm an incredibly boring person and I'm totally okay with that. And when I meet new people or, sometimes there's like those icebreakers where they're like, tell us about yourself, one exciting thing about yourself. And I'm like, well, there's nothing that exciting about my life. It's quite boring. And that is exactly what I don't want the excitement anymore because I feel like the high is like once you come down from that, like it's just like it's such a hard crash. Yeah. And so thank you.
But when you tell people you're boring, because I do the same thing and people will come back with it's like, oh, I'm sure you're not, or don't like they think that you're saying something negative. And I'm like, no, I'm like, that means life is pretty good, right? There's nothing out of the whack. But the thing I wanted to know is because about the boring as well, as a parent, and you mentioned that a lot of your work, at least in the beginning, and I think still now is with juveniles. And so I'm curious because children today, now I sound like an old person, have such a different experience than I did, and probably even both of you did. Maybe you're a little younger, Kaela, so maybe not as much, but where they have never known life to be boring. right?
Yeah.
Because they have constant stimulation they've got a device at every moment. There's something to entertain them. They don't know how to be bored. And I think, at least when I was a kid, and probably you too, like, our parents made us be bored, or we had to be
Yeah.
bored. There was just nothing, like, there wasn't a lot to do. And it was like, you had to feel like you're out of fill that time. And so I wonder, with children now growing up in the state where they don't know boredom, they're uncomfortable with boredom. Do you feel like that, and also for adults, because it's affecting us all, but living in this digital age, does that change our relationship with contentedness and finding a place of peace with that? Do you think it makes it more difficult?
I absolutely think it does. I think it does in like a lot of different ways. I was just talking to my friend about this the other day, and he was like, I don't feel like I have a good imagination. And I was like, I would hate if that was true. I was like, I don't believe that that's true. I do think that we don't have to use our imagination much anymore. It's one of like the issues with like generative AI. It's also one of the issues with like you mentioned, Becky, like constantly being on a tablet, constantly having information fed to you and really not being able to like process things. My Nana was very much like, you have to get out of the house and go play. Like, just like go outside, come home when the streetlights come on, be bored, read books. But like, no one was around to constantly entertain me as a child at all. And I feel like that's kind of what media has done now. But I think we see the consequences of that in our media, that it's no longer like, instead of having shows that have a lot of depth or even movies with depth, we just have like a lot of movies. It's like a quantity versus quality thing. And I think it affects the way that we communicate with one another and the expectations that we have of people. Like, I rewatched Sex and the City simultaneously with my sister, who is like 11 years younger than me. And our takeaway, granted, she's 11 years younger than me. So our takeaways from the show were very different. But I was like, at the time, I think everyone my age thought that they would move to New York City and have the sort of wild, adventurous kind of life. I think that that's unattainable in new, fun, economic ways now. But at the time, it was just like, can I move to a city and like be close to my core group of friends and try to like be happy? Like, there are very few like filler episodes in Sex and the City. Like, something's always happening.
Yeah.
And I think that we see that kind of now even in media. Like, every day, if you were to talk to my sister, every day something exciting is happening to her. And I'm like, I just want to take a nap. And I think that though, like, shapes her like broader picture of like what being an adult is. It's like this fast paced moving thing. Granted, she lives in New York City, so it is more fast paced than where I live. But I think that those things all kind of go hand in hand, like people's inability to sit in boredom, but I think also sit in discomfort, has led to a lot of like where we are in society now.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. You brought up like Sex in the City, because it also makes me think of shows like How I Met Your Mother or Friends or Living Single, where it's like the things that people from our generation grew up on was about like going on this grand adventure. Like, life was like this grand adventure, and anything that doesn't feel like an adventure, then it doesn't feel like your life is measuring up.
Yeah.
Like, you're living your life. And so I don't know what the kids these days are growing up on, or the kids just a few years younger than us are growing up on.
I do. They're growing
really
up on
out of touch.
Mr. Beast, and like they're growing up on like gaming. It is, how quickly can I just, like, I will watch my son who's 9 on a device, and it's like this, just like the constant need for new, right? And it does worry me, because what is that? And I now I'm taking over again. This is so fascinating.
It's okay.
You guys. I love brain science stuff. How is that changing our brains? Like, what is it?
Yeah.
Have you done anything or read anything about that, about what that's actually doing to the human brain and how it's developing this like constant stimulation?
So I haven't done any of that work. I would say there's like the attention span of it all. I know people have looked into that, the idea that we have shorter attention spans, the idea that we as a society are moving to like, people are confusing comprehension. Like, people don't have the ability to comprehend things as much or like process things as deeply as they once were able to. People also, because of algorithms, and I think that this is personally fascinating, like the idea of your algorithm as an echo chamber. So like, you're not used to confronting new ideas or being challenged, and like how to handle conflict, or even for a lot of people, how to handle like human interaction. Like, one of the big things just for me as a person, right? I work from home. I live in like Mableton, Georgia, which is like the middle of nowhere. Not really, but like there's not a lot here. But it's very easy for me to accidentally forget that like I haven't spoken to another person. for a couple of days. And then I see the like stiffness in interactions when I do go hang out with people. And I'm like, oh, I've got to do this more. It's so easy to remain insular. And I think the brain as like an organ and ecosystem, it thrives off of, even though it's like protecting you from harm, it thrives off of new experiences. It's how it learns. It's how it teaches you things. It's also how you form like memories and core parts of your personality. So if you've never had to face conflict, if you've never like disagreed with someone in person, right? An interaction, having a fight with someone online is different than having an interaction in person. And I do think we see that like in a sort of age divide kind of way, where like my sister has a fast mouth online, but in person, it's me who wins the fights. Do you know what I mean? Like there's something also to the speed and the wit of which you process information that I think is missing now. So there are like, I would say like no one's looking at like cellular changes, but they're looking a lot at like the social and behavioral neuroscience of it. It has been really fascinating. And it's also interesting because it's not something you can necessarily study in animal models. So it's like as people age, these sort of longitudinal studies will become more interesting and important to see the difference over time.
Yeah. Wow. So I know I'm going to pivot a little bit here because I know you also founded an organization for other scientists like Black and people of color scientists. Can you tell us about a little bit about that org and what prompted you to start that? Why did you think that was an important thing to do?
Yeah. So I'm one of the co-founders of Black and Neuro, which is a nonprofit. I was the former president. My term just recently ended. And we started in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, specifically with the Black birder incident that happened in Central Park. That's the name of that park. And so it was after that incident. I can't remember that man's name. That's going to bother me. Cooper was his last. Amy Cooper was the woman. Sorry. There was a woman who essentially like called the police on a Black man who was
the
like
guy
watching
who was birding.
Yeah, he was birding. And so after that incident happened, she like called the police on him.
And
it
was
like,
also Cooper, so you were right. It was Christian Cooper. And Amy Cooper, and it was weird that they had the same last name.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So they had this interaction in the park where he asked her to leash her dog. She wouldn't. She called the police and said that he was attacking her and recorded it. And then after that, Black Birders Week started, which was essentially like a social media movement where they encouraged Black birders to be like, show up on the internet and like go birding. And so there was Black Birders Week, there was Black in the Astro. And so Black people in like different sects of science really came through to like show representation and start to build community with one another. And so Black and Neuro started after those weeks. And it really started with a tweet from our founding president, Angeline Dukes, where she was like, are we going to do Black and Neuro Week? Like, does anybody have time to do it? And so about like 20 of us came together to have the first official Black and Neuro Week, where we had programming, we had lectures on like neuro-racism, we had professional development workshops. And from there we grew to now we have like over 1,000 members. We're like an official nonprofit. We have like over 1,000 members, and we do all kinds of programming for Black people in neuroscience, both to build community, but also like provide resources for them over time.
Wow. What is neuro-racism?
So neuro-racism is really, it's the ways in which science has been used to sort of like prop up racism and as a tool to like affirm racist ideology. We see this most clearly with things like IQ. We see it also with like when we talk about curing diseases, the idea that like we'll cure Alzheimer's in a cishet white man before we will anyone else, almost with any other disease. But it's also the ways that racism manifests like changes in the brain. Dr. Bianca Jones-Marlin does research on this idea that like trauma impacts you on a cellular level. And her research looks at how like trauma affects offspring specifically, but new theories have hypothesized that like we know that violence affects people as well. Like if you're perpetuating violence on someone, that also is likely affecting your brain. And so how can we study that and what does that look like? And so neuro-racism is really like the bridge of all of those things. Like how is neuroscience being used to justify racism? How do we see that show up in society and social society levels? And then what are the sort of like trauma-informed responses to that? And so normally that portion of like Black and Neuro Week, which is something we do every week, or not every week, like once a year as like a virtual conference, there's normally like a journal club and a recent paper that we sort of unpack with the experts from that paper, but then also people in the community. And so sometimes the studies are more like, what are the like ramifications or differences that we see in Black people in certain fields? Like how many, like what is the leaky pipeline of academia? Is it really like that Black people aren't going into these fields, or are they going and unwelcomed? And like, why do they leave and what makes them stay? And how can we like increase that for people?
Well, so there's some kind of correlation between engaging in racism or being a part of that system and the makeup of like how that affects your brain. Did I hear you right?
Yeah.
Is that sort of the epigenetics?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because I don't know if you've read My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, but
But I've heard of it.
It's so good. And the reason it was so powerful for me as a white person was that it was interesting reading about that piece of like the epigenetics of the violent history of this country affect all of us, right? Because I thought what you were just saying about how being a perpetrator of violence affects your brain. And that immediately made me think of that book and that idea of this like legacy of enslaving people and being on the other side of that, right? On the white side of that, of the wrong side of that, and how that also altered brains, right? And it's interesting to think about the legacy of of American history on everyone who has existed inside of it, and that no one escapes that, whether, you know, you're on either, whatever your lineage is, we've all been a part of that system and it affects all of our brains. So I just think that's really, I love that you mentioned that. It made me think of that book because it sort of talks a bit about that. Really interesting. Can I suggest a pivot? But I don't want, like, if you want to keep going here, it's okay. But I also want to make sure, because you started out, Taina, by saying you reconnected with Kaela about manifestation and the brain and that. And I think manifestation, who are really sciencey, I think they often think like, I could be wrong, but I have a feeling that the more sciencey people are like, poo-poo, that's not science. And the manifesting people who would hear something like, oh, poo-poo, the science people, they're missing out. And I just think it's interesting when you meet people who are like, yeah, I'm science. I think about things rationally. I look at what is, I study, but also I'm open to the fact that there could be more than what we know. Cause that to me is what science should do, is like acknowledge that there are things that we can't know, because what we know now is not what scientists knew 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, whatever. So I would love to know more about that journey of like, what made you approach her, Taina? And then like, what was the reaction? Cause were you hesitant at all of like, is she going to be like, oh gosh, manifestation?
I definitely was like, is she going to think I'm a crazy person? But I reached out because, again, I knew that we were part of the same alumni network, and I love, you post a lot of like your cooking stuff. And I'm just like, oh, this is just, I love this vibe. But I started doing research into the neuroscience behind manifestation, because I've always been the kind of person that's like, manifestation poo-poo, like that's like some weird woo-woo stuff for people who are out of touch with reality. Like you can't manifest your way out of systemic racism or poverty, or, you know, like there are real obstacles that people are facing, and to tell someone that, oh, you just manifest and you can get what you want, that feels like gaslighting to me. And so I think something came across on like my Instagram maybe, or on YouTube, about Dr. Jim Doty, who was on the Melanie, she shares the last name with, what is his name? Damn it, I forgot. Anyway, Dr. Jim Doty, he's a neuroscientist out of Stanford, and surgeon as well. And he was talking about the science behind some of manifestation principles. And I was like, well, this is interesting. I've never heard what seems like two radically opposite perspectives come together like this. Or Mel Robbins, yes, thank you, because she has the same last name as Tony Robbins, and I'm always like, are they related? Is she his wife? Like, what's going on there? But I don't think they're related. But yeah, like two seemingly contradictory perspectives like come together in one person who is like straddling this equilibrium between both. And so I started doing research about neuroscience and how that affects the brain and how that affects your lived reality as an individual. And then it got to the point where like I was talking about it with other people, and I was like, well, I don't want to be talking about it in a way that's not absolute and in a way that's like misleading to people. So then I was like, I have to like, for my own due diligence, like I feel like I have to talk to someone about this. And then lo and behold, one of Kaela's beautiful dinners showed up on my Instagram feed. And so I was like, I wonder if she would be willing to talk to me about it. And she was. So I'm curious, Kaela, like, what did you think when I approached you?
I didn't think I had any strong thoughts. I was just kind of like, oh, that's neat. Yeah, would love to learn more about or talk more about that. I don't feel like my family has always been woo adjacent. So, but I completely understand Becky's point about the Venn diagram of people who think meditation is silly and people who are hardcore scientists doesn't have as much overlap as you would think. Or actually maybe it's a closer complete circle than most people would think. That being said, I think scientists use objectivity in a bad way a lot of the times. And I think this is one of those ways, because really what meditation gives you and what manifesting gives you is a shift in perspective. And we know through more psychology based work, less heavy neuroscience, which is also in and of itself a fight that some people have. There are some researchers who are neuroscience is more cells and less motivation, less personality, less there's a reason that we have behavioral and social neuroscience as sort of subsects of neuroscience, just because of what those people value. But to me, in our discussion, what I thought was really interesting was just that you were excited about it, that you were like, oh, is there some sort of actual mechanism for this? Because I think what's happening a lot in today's society is people have more access to information than they ever have had before. And they don't always have the outlet or a resource to talk about those things. So to me, it was a cool way to use information that I had about the brain, but also anecdotal stories and research of other friends to help answer a question or clarify things for you. But I think to me, the power of manifestation in that intersection of neuroscience comes from being in tune with your body and understanding, again, back to that equilibrium. And I also think manifestation and things like meditation emphasize to me that back to the boredom thing, people don't have time to just be, to just sort of sit and observe. And I think that that's really valuable and important.
Yeah. And I think that was the biggest thing that I've taken away so far from the stuff that I've read from Dr. Jim Doty and the conversation that I had with you is that usually when people think about manifestation, or the way that I've seen people talk about manifestation, it's almost like if you grew up in super religious circles, it's a name it and claim it kind of thing. Yeah. That's not the science behind it at all. The science behind it is about how to figure out where to focus your attention. But in order to do that, you have to be able to be present, and you have to be able to be bored and be uncomfortable and sit still for a little while and know what your body is telling you and understand yourself enough to know which direction you want to go in. And so I thought that was a really expansive way to think about, how to shift your lived reality by shifting your focus, shifting where you put your attention. Because again, dopamine hacking is not going to get you out of systemic poverty. Manifesting is not necessarily going to get you out of systemic poverty either. But like you said, the shift in perspective, that's where the power is. I think that's where, as individuals, we have agency and power over our lived realities by being able to shift our perspective, so we can then put our energy and attention into things that can help us overcome or help us navigate certain obstacles and whatnot. Sorry, didn't mean to get all coachy there.
Well, it feels like a change from reactive to proactive in a way of it's that shift of being in a state of constant reaction to everything.
Yeah.
And instead shifting to what can I do here? What is possible? Where do I want to go? How do I shift my focus into something that feels less defeated? And again, all of that inside of the context of very real systemic issues that are often outside of your control. I just had this conversation yesterday with a woman I met who does mindset work in a very traditional way that maybe some of us don't love, which is this idea that, your thoughts are of your own making and you can control those thoughts, and that changes your reality. And there is a piece of that I think is real, right? Because I can choose to right now think, oh, it'd sure be nice if it was sunny, or I could talk about hey, at least it's, it feels nice that it's breezy today, right? But that's very different than saying, well, I can choose to say, well, I can let racism get me or I won't today, when it's like that's something so far outside of your control. So I just think there's it's always a fine line with all of this stuff, it seems like. I don't know if any of that sparks anything for you, Kaela, but I'd love to hear what I said.
Yeah. No, I think so. I think there's also something to one of the things that I think capitalism really takes from us is like time, absolutely, but also the ability to try new things and the time and energy to be a part of something new. I find I'm very much a whatever gets you through the day kind of person. That being said, I also am known in my family to be a judgy hater, but I think at my core, I'm a person who really values shifts in perspectives and transformations in that way. I think there's something to taking something you're interested in, like science and societal issues, and seeing where they intersect and seeing how they can support one another, and sort of questioning what is our what are our roles in society, and how can I what are the tools that I can use to help me be a better functioning member of this specific community, of my specific family, of this friend group. And I feel like the intersection of self-care and science has really taken off as both a multi-million dollar, maybe even billion-dollar industry at this point. But I also think it's interesting because a lot of those ideas, the ideas of manifestation of self-care, radical self-care, are rooted in Black liberation and Black revolutionaries in general. And so it's interesting to see the parts that capitalism forces us to pick and choose, and the parts that people genuinely return back to because they work, right? The idea that if you take the time to sit and meditate, if you take time 10 minutes for yourself at the start of the day to write down your intentions, to be with yourself, to be present, studies show, psychology, human-based studies show that those people are living happier, healthier lives. And I think that those that sort of cyclical nature and circular nature of it is always really interesting to me.
Yeah. So you co-founded the Black and Neuro nonprofit, and you also mentioned just about in your 20s going through some friendship breakups. And so one thing that we talk a lot about on the podcast is community, right? It's so important to be a part of a community that challenges you, but also supports you and just holds you down, when things are hard. And I feel right now things are really hard for a lot of people. And I don't think it's going to get any better. I honestly don't. I don't know if some people might call that pessimistic, but I think we're really just seeing the tip of the iceberg here. And so I'm curious, with your science background and so much of the attacks that are happening on science these days, right? Where people are just don't believe vaccines work. The granola to MAGA pipeline is a real thing, for a reason. I'm just curious, how are you, in the messiness of all of that, how are you finding ways as a scientist and a friend to people, and a member of different communities, how are you finding ways to ground yourself and not necessarily stay optimistic, but stay contented, because I think that toxic optimism also is not where we want to be.
Yeah, I feel that's a really great series of questions. It's something that I am trying to think about and be really intentional with daily. So I think that's the first part, is that it's kind of a daily, weekly sort of struggle. But for me, I think two really big things. The first is that scientists, so much of being a scientist is being trained to be a leader. And I actually think in this current hellscape of a political climate, we need more followers. We need more people who are willing to use their resources to help communities in different ways. I think one of the things that all of Trump's attacks on science have taught us is that scientists have not valued people's understanding of their work and what they do and why it's important. We sort of have taken for granted vaccine effectiveness and what it does and how vaccines work. My family it's a family of Capricorns. And so it's very much a group of people who default to experts about things. They're if you know something, then I believe that you know it. You just have to be a person of authority in that position. And I think scientists in a big way have taken that for granted. And so I think for me, a big part of it is encouraging scientists to like get back to their communities, like explain to people what you do and why it matters to rebuild trust in the institution that is science. Because even from the start of the pandemic in 2020, we saw that people all of a sudden became virologists and were like public health experts. And I said, since when?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think like that's a big part of it for me in terms of like, for me, it feels a lot like, because I am like not in academia anymore, not doing research explicitly anymore. It's a lot of me giving scientists sort of like ego checks about like, you don't get to like ego, but also like God complex elitism checks, where it's like, you don't get to be a jerk to someone who doesn't understand viral transduction. Like that's the failure of the education system, but like you use those tax dollars to fund your research and thus you do owe them an explanation of like what's going on. And so I think it's about reinstilling trust in science. I think another big part of being a community member for me now is like thinking more locally about community. I think Black and Neuro has been a global movement since it started. And that's been beautiful and wonderful. And there's like a core team of about like 20 neuroscientists or people interested in neuroscience who run Black and Neuro. And like that group within a group has always been really important to me. But in this past, like, I don't know, since January, it's felt like 8 years. But in this past like time, it's been really important for me to be a part of my like local community, right? So like, it's one of the reasons why I started taking so many art classes. It's one of the reasons why like I try to know my neighbors now. Like I'm trying to be of service to people in a new way that I think is unprecedented. Like scientists are trained to think big about things, and I want them to use their skills to like think more insularly about like what they're doing. One, because it's rewarding, but two, I also think it's kind of how we survive this point in time where it's like I don't know, I'm like volunteering at food banks and soup kitchens. I'm like going to teach-ins and sit-ins and like using my skills as a communicator, a science communicator, but still like someone who reads and writes and can talk in large crowds, to like have difficult conversations at churches, even though I'm not religious, to like talk to people about electoral politics and why I think they're a scam, but why voting is what it is. Like, I think it's kind of like the transferable skills of it all that I want scientists to tap more into, to like serve their community in new ways while we have these funding pushes. I also think that there's like something to the creativity of like, there are a lot of people who are upset about the cuts in science funding, but aren't upset about like the erasure of DEI initiatives. And that personally like upsets me great deep. But they also are thinking about them. It's a lot of like white men who are like, my lab is not going to exist anymore. And that sucks. And I'm like, neither are the jobs for the like Black and brown people that work in your lab though, or work on your floor. And so I want them to be more creative in those kinds of measures, if that makes sense, where it's like, how can we share science? How can we share resources? How can we get through the next month together as a lab? Everybody keeps a job. How can we get through the next 6 months, the next year? But that requires being more community oriented than I think we're used to. Sorry, I don't know if I've answered your question or gone on a new tangent.
Yeah. No. Well, and I know we have to wrap up, but I really think it would be remiss if we didn't at least ask about, because you work in grant making and you are dealing with federal funding dollars and all of that. And we know what's happening with all of these cuts that you mentioned with, grant, with science funding across the board from the federal government, but the way that that's affecting a lot of people. And I'm just curious, as somebody who's sort of really tied into all of that, what does it mean? Because I think, as you talked about, people aren't always educated on these things. I think for a lot of people, it's like, oh, well, who cares if we cut a $2 million grant to study something in mice? Like, that doesn't feel relevant to me. Can you talk just a little bit about why that stuff matters and what the like long-term implications,
long-term impact?
Yeah. I think, so like in a strictly science capacity, it means like the lack of scientific innovations. We will not be able to make vaccines, like treat diseases, have preventative care and technology. Like science is an enterprise, right? The NIH is the number one funder of science in the world, not just America. And so these cuts will greatly impact people's ability to do science, kind of period. It will also change the landscape of what kind of science gets done. We know that when Black and brown people do research, like they are not more interested, but they're interested in research from their backgrounds to help them. Like we see this with the idea that like Black researchers often go to like elite universities and then return to their communities to do family medicine, to open clinics, to do that kind of work. And those things will sort of cease to happen. We'll have like I mentioned earlier, instead of cures for diseases that are across even like men and women or race or ethnicity, it will be research that's focused sort of in this homogenous group of people. And so like science will slow. I think for me, the bigger issue is that people will lose their jobs. People will lose their jobs. They will become poor in a society, in a system in America that has massive cuts to government funded assistance, right? Whether that's SNAP or things like the library or national parks or whatever. And we've already like criminalized poverty in this country so much that we will see these sort of irrevocable ramifications of society as a whole, right? I think we're seeing that now where scientists are losing their jobs, and this is like a whole new class of unemployed people, like people with PhDs, people with master's degrees, some better or worse, some who have never had to deal with anything difficult in their life, now being faced without having a job and like perhaps not having the savviness or the resources or the know-how on how to bounce back. So we'll see the continuation of like millennials who live with their family, like people who only have generational wealth or like are married to wealth, being able to continue throughout science and through that pipeline. There's a really great Dr. Neil Lewis, who is at Cornell University. He is what is his technical title? He's in like social psychology, I believe, but he cited recently a really great paper that talks about the ramifications of major job layoffs to society. And I think those kinds of things will continue. So for me, it's like, it's hard because for me, I'm like, science won't continue and that's sad. In that it's catastrophic to like the infrastructure of a lot of things, but I care so much more about people. There will be like men, women, trans, non-binary folks who are not able to do the research that like fuels them and drives them. There will be a lower number of like Black girls going into STEM and people being turned away from that curiosity. And I think that to me matters more. Like the humanity aspect of it, I think is really important. And I think that sometimes that's missing. I think a lot of the times professors are talking in abstracts. Like they're like, we don't know what's going to happen. And I'm like, we know exactly what's going to happen. You're going to have to fire that postdoc.
Yeah.
They have a family with them, and now that family is going to be in poverty. And then we can guess like 6 different ways that will affect them. But like people's livelihoods will change, and the healthcare system will also ultimately change as well. Not for the better, obviously.
Yeah.
So it's just a lot of...
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah. And I think it's a domino effect that like some universities now have completely canceled their like PhD interim classes for the next year, where I can't remember which university did it, but they rescinded offers and they were like, we won't have like PhD in biology program this year. And that will have huge consequences, both to science and to people.
Yeah. Well,
thank you for sharing that, just because I think people don't fully grasp. And it's also part of that effect of so many things happening that it's like, it's hard to really contextualize all of it. So thank you for doing that. And I know we need to wrap up. I wanted to ask a fun question because I know you're a big reader. I saw that you love literary fiction, and so do I. So what's the best book you read lately?
Oh my God. Do I have it over here?
Oh, I'm so excited.
No, I don't. Sorry. This house is like filled with books. I have been reading a lot of books by Hanif. I can't say his last name. I can look it up. He recently published, the first book I read by him was called They Can't Kill Us Till They Kill Us. And it's a collection of essays that he wrote about like music and art. He has a really great essay that like made me cry in a restaurant about like the rebirth of New Orleans and like the Little Boozy Wipe Me Down song. Like he is such a gifted writer. Let's see if I can find it.
Is it Abdurraqib?
Yes. I don't know how to pronounce it. I should
have this one. Got that close. Abduraqib. We'll put it in the show notes.
Yes. I've really been loving reading books by him. He has another one that I just read called Devil in America, which is about Black performance and Black art and growing up in Ohio and choosing to stay in Ohio, and what that is like. I'm trying to think. I haven't gotten into fantasy books. If anybody has any fantasy book recommendations, I will take them because people keep trying to shove it on me. But the next book that I'm reading is Portrait of a Thief by Grace D. Lee, which I haven't read, but I've heard is very good. Yeah, tons of books. I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
Well, I don't have a fantasy. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. I don't want you to lose your thoughts.
Chain Gang All-Stars was a book that I read for my book club at the beginning of the year, and that was really great. It was a great book club book. It's essentially about a dystopian society that hits very close to home to America, where people who are incarcerated basically can fight for their freedom by like this sort of Hunger Games gladiator style duels. The book is written so wonderfully. It's not just about that. It's also about like love and community and what it means to like sacrifice for one another and how to grieve loss. And so that's another great book.
Yeah. Well, I was thank you for those recommendations, by the way. But I was gonna say I don't know if it's considered fantasy. It's fanfic. But I have been telling everybody about it since I read it. It's Draco Malfoy and the mortifying ordeal of being in love. So if like you grew up on Harry Potter, it's right up that alley, and it's long, and I'm not used to reading fiction, but I devoured it in like 6 days.
Okay.
It was literally one of the best things I've ever read. And I heard about it from another podcast.
Okay.
The BRB Crying podcast. They talked about it on an episode. And yeah, I'm rereading it, even though I just finished it a few weeks ago, because it's just that good.
This reminds me, I also finished Universality by Natasha Brown the other day, which is like very short. It's less than 200 pages. And it's about so many things. It's about capitalism. It's about like women in power. It's about community it's about classism in community and like what that looks like and how it feels. And she packs such a punch in those like less than 200 pages. That was also a really great read. Honestly, I could do this for hours.
I know.
Like I could do just this part.
I've heard of Universality, so that was on my list. So it's nice to hear somebody say it was good. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing all that. Thank you for sharing everything. I loved this conversation, and I could talk about any of the tangents we went on probably for a lot longer. So I appreciate it. Taina, do you want to wrap us up or anything else that you want to say?
Yeah, no. Thanks again, Kaela. Where can people find out about Black and Neuro?
Yeah, you can find out about Black and Neuro at blackandneuro.com. We have Black and Neuro is our handle on Blue Sky, but also Instagram and X or Twitter if people are still using that as well. But we have shifted to different platforms. Yeah, we're all over the internet.
Okay. And where can people find you and look at your beautiful dinner and CSA box?
That's true. You can find me at kss-phd.com, but also on Instagram at kssphd, and on Blue Sky, similar handle, kssphd.
Well, thank you again so much for your time and for letting us pick through your brain on all these different tangents that we went on, like Becky said.
Yeah, no, of course, this is so great. I would do it again 1,000 times over.
Thanks for listening to Messy Liberation.
Will you please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen?
I know people say that all the time, and if you're like me, often you just go on to the next podcast, but truly, taking that moment to do that will really help us reach a wider audience.
Thank you so much for your support and for listening today.
Until next time.